I said move it, lady. You deaf or just stupid? The voice was a rasp, sharpened by impatience. It cut through the morning air on the wide marble plaza. The first thing she noticed was the hand. Not the one gesturing dismissively, but the one resting on the black grip of a service weapon. It wasn't a threat. It was a posture. The casual ownership of power. A dozen people on the courthouse steps paused, their own morning hustles arrested by the sudden spike in tension. Phones, which had been tucked away, began to rise like periscopes. She saw the glint of a screen, a small red indicating a recording had begun. She stood perfectly still, her leather briefcase in one hand, a simple paper cup of black coffee in the other. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply held her ground, a small, still point in the swirling eddy of his aggression. He was a wall of navy blue and Kevlar, his face flushed with a petty authority that soured the beautiful morning. What he didn't know, what no one on those steps could possibly know, was that the woman he was about to shove was the Honorable Annalise Washington, Judge of the United States District Court. What he couldn't imagine was that in less than 1 hour, his name, Officer Frank Miller, was the first on her docket, and his entire future rested in the palm of the hand he was about to strike. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The day had begun, as it always did, in silence. The house was still dark, the only light spilling from the small lamp on the polished mahogany desk in her study. 5:15 a.m. The alarm was a formality she hadn't needed in 30 years. Her internal clock was set to a rhythm of discipline and purpose, a legacy from her father. He had been a man of ritual, a civil rights lawyer who believed that the fight for justice began with the quiet ordering of one's own soul. Annalise sat at his desk, the one he'd used to draft briefs that had chipped away at the granite walls of segregation. The air smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and the faint, lingering scent of the pipe tobacco he'd given up years before he passed. She ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood. It was her first touchstone of the day. On a small velvet cloth lay his watch, a simple steel timepiece from the 1960s, its face clean and unadorned. It wasn't valuable, not in the way the world measured value. But it was priceless. It had been on his wrist when he argued before the appellate court, on his wrist when he'd faced down threats, on his wrist the day he held her, a newborn, for the first time. Each morning, she wound it. The quiet, mechanical clicks were a conversation with his memory, a reminder of the patience required to make the gears of justice turn. Click, click, click. 21 turns. Always 21. She slipped the watch onto her wrist. Its cool weight was a familiar comfort, a piece of armor no one could see. She had learned a long time ago that the world would try to strip you of your dignity. It would come for your peace, your name, your humanity. You had to anchor yourself to something it couldn't touch. For her, it was this ritual, this inheritance. Next was coffee. The kitchen was sleek and modern, a contrast to the study. Her husband, David, had designed it. He was a man of clean lines and open spaces, a retired architect whose love was as steady and unobtrusive as the foundations he used to lay. The aroma of dark roast coffee began to fill the space, a rich, earthy scent that signaled the true start of the day. She measured the beans, ground them, and watched the slow drip into the carafe. Counting the drops was another small, grounding act, a way of reclaiming the present moment. As the coffee brewed, she stood at the large window overlooking her garden. The first hint of dawn was bruising the eastern sky with shades of lavender and rose. The city was still a silhouette, a sleeping giant. She loved this time of day, this quiet threshold. It was a moment of pure potential before the world rushed in with its demands and its disappointments. David came in behind her, his movements silent. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that for a full minute, watching the light change. He was her family anchor, the one who saw not the judge, but Annalise. His presence was a language all its own. Long docket today, he finally murmured, his voice still thick with sleep. Always, she said, leaning back into him. A few motions, a sentencing, and a preliminary hearing for an officer-involved civil rights case. He squeezed her gently. Be safe. It was what he always said. It wasn't about the cases themselves, which happened in the controlled environment of her courtroom. It was about the journey there and back. It was about the world outside the courthouse walls, a world that didn't always recognize the robe. She poured 2 cups of coffee. They sat at the small kitchen island, the silence comfortable, punctuated only by the soft clink of ceramic on stone. He read the headlines on his tablet. She reviewed the notes she'd made the night before. Her handwriting was a precise, elegant script, another inheritance from her father. Clear, concise, unambiguous. Officer Frank Miller, she read aloud, more to herself than to David. The name was just a name, a set of facts on a page. Accused of excessive force during an arrest. A history of civilian complaints, most dismissed. The U.S. Attorney's Office was bringing the case, signaling its seriousness. It was a machine case. A case about a cog in a system that was grinding people down. She'd seen hundreds like it. The details varied, but the pattern was depressingly familiar. She let herself feel the weariness for exactly 60 seconds. The weight of it. The endless, grinding repetition of the same injustice, different names, different faces. Then, she put it away. Feeling it was a luxury. Acting on it was a necessity. She closed her notebook. Time to go, she said. She rinsed her cup, kissed David's forehead, and went to get ready. Her uniform was a simple, well-tailored black suit, a silk blouse. Her armor for the world outside. Dignified, professional, unimpeachable. She gathered her briefcase, the worn leather soft under her fingers. Inside were the files, the facts, the architecture of the law. As she walked to the garage, the morning sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, casting long shadows across the driveway. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that held no malice, the kind of day that felt like a promise. She got into her car, a modest but well-maintained sedan, and placed her briefcase on the passenger seat. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was at stake each day she drove to that courthouse. She carried it with her, in the weight of her father's watch and the quiet resolve in her own heart. The engine turned over with a soft hum. Just the road and the engine and the morning air. Simple. Final. The drive to the federal courthouse was another of her rituals. 22 minutes without traffic. She never turned on the radio. The silence was a buffer, a space to prepare her mind for the structured conflict of the courtroom. She drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets of her neighborhood, the houses still sleeping. Then onto the freeway, where the city began to wake up, a river of steel and light flowing downtown. She watched the faces in the other cars. A woman applying makeup in the rearview mirror. A man singing along to a song only he could hear. A construction worker with a thermos, his face etched with fatigue. Each of them living a story, a universe of concerns and hopes entirely separate from her own. It was a good reminder. The law was not an abstract concept. It was about the lives of these people, the invisible threads of contract and consequence that held their society together. As she exited the freeway, the skyline of the city rose to meet her. Glass towers reflected the climbing sun. The federal courthouse was a monument of granite and marble, solid and imposing. It was meant to project permanence, stability, the weight of the institution it housed. For Annalise, it was simply her place of work. She had walked its halls for 15 years, first as a prosecutor, then as a judge. She knew the echo of its corridors, the smell of its libraries, the way the light fell through the tall, arched windows in the afternoon. She parked in her designated spot in the underground garage, a small perquisite of her position. But this morning, the garage was full. A maintenance crew was resurfacing a section, their trucks and equipment taking up 24 spaces, including hers. A small, handwritten sign pointed to overflow parking in a public lot 3 blocks away. A flicker of annoyance. It was minor, a disruption to a carefully calibrated routine. But she let it go. Adaptability was part of the job. She backed out and navigated the downtown streets to the public lot. It cost her 6 minutes. She decided to walk the 3 blocks. The morning was too fine to waste in a taxi. Besides, she liked to feel the city's pulse before entering the cloistered world of the court. The walk took her past a coffee cart, the steam rising in the cool air. The smell was irresistible. It was a small, unplanned pleasure. She bought a simple black coffee, the heat of the paper cup warming her hands. She was now running 9 minutes behind her usual schedule. Not late, but later than she preferred. It meant her usual quiet moment in her chambers before court would be shortened. She picked up her pace slightly, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the pavement. As she approached the courthouse plaza, she saw the crowd. It wasn't a protest, not organized. It was a bottleneck. A line of people waiting to get through the single security checkpoint that was open at the main entrance. 2 of the 3 X-ray machines were down. Again, the city's budget cuts were a constant, low-grade fever affecting every public service. The line snaked from the doors, down the grand marble steps, and onto the plaza. There were lawyers in suits, defendants in street clothes, jurors with their summonses clutched in their hands. A cross-section of the city, all funneled into this one slow-moving queue. And directing it all were 2 courthouse police officers. One was a young woman, patiently answering questions. The other was the man whose name was on her docket. Officer Frank Miller. Annalise didn't recognize him at first. He was just a uniform, a presence of authority. He was barking at people, his voice unnecessarily loud, performing his power for the assembled audience. One line. I'm not going to say it again. Have your IDs out. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest. The casual contempt. The joyless exercise of minor power. She had seen it her whole life. She found her place at the back of the line, taking a sip of her coffee. The sun was warm on her face. She would be patient. She would wait her turn like everyone else. She believed in the process, even when it was inconvenient. But the line barely moved. Miller was creating the friction himself, taking too long with each person, finding fault with IDs, forcing people to empty their pockets onto a folding table before they even reached the building. It was a performance of control. Annalise checked her father's watch. 8:45 a.m. Court convened at 9:30. She had 45 minutes. Still time. But the anxiety of the crowd was palpable, a low hum of frustration. A young man ahead of her, a student by the look of his backpack, asked Miller a question. Officer, is there another entrance we can use? Miller got into his face. Does it look like there's another entrance? Use your eyes. Stay in the line. He physically nudged the student back. That was when Annalise decided to act. Not out of privilege, but out of necessity. As a judge, she had a separate entrance. She rarely used it, preferring to enter with the public she served. But today, time was a factor. Her duty was to the docket, to the people waiting for justice inside the building. She stepped out of the line and walked calmly towards the side of the steps, aiming for the employee entrance which was just around the corner. She kept a wide berth around Officer Miller. She didn't want a confrontation. She just wanted to get to work. He saw her. His eyes narrowed. He had found a new target. Hey, you. Where do you think you're going? He shouted, his voice echoing across the plaza. Annalise stopped. She turned to face him, her expression neutral. Good morning, officer. I'm just heading to the side entrance. The back of the line is over there, he said, jabbing a thumb towards the queue. He started walking towards her, closing the space between them. His walk was a swagger, a deliberate show of dominance. I understand, Annalise said, her voice even and calm. I have judicial credentials. I have a hearing to preside over in less than an hour. He laughed. A short, sharp, ugly sound. Judicial credentials? Right. And I'm the Chief Justice. Get back in line, lady. He was now standing directly in front of her, blocking her path. He was taller than her, and he used his height to loom over her. The behavioral signature. He was crowding her space. Officer, she began again, keeping her voice low. I am Judge Annalise Washington. My courtroom is on the 4th floor. If you'd like to see my identification, I'd be happy to show you. She made a slow, deliberate movement to shift her coffee to her briefcase hand, freeing the other to reach for her purse. I don't want to see your identification, he sneered, making air quotes with his fingers. I've seen 100 fake IDs today. I said move it, lady. You deaf or just stupid? He was close enough now that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. She saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger. Something colder. Contempt. The inability to see her as human, as anything other than an obstacle to his authority. I will not get back in line, she said, her voice dropping to a quiet but firm register. I'm going to walk to the employee entrance. You are interfering with federal court business. That was a mistake. She had challenged him directly. His face darkened. You're not going anywhere, he growled. And then he shoved her. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a hard, two-handed shove to her chest. It was meant to move her, to humiliate her. The hot coffee flew from her grasp, splashing across the front of her suit. The paper cup hit the marble with a soft thud. Her briefcase tumbled from her other hand, skidding across the ground. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of a step. For a moment, the world tilted. The sounds of the plaza faded. There was the rough scrape of stone against her suit, the sharp impact on her hip and elbow as she fell. She landed in a heap at the bottom of the short flight of stairs, the contents of her briefcase, papers, a pen, her notebook, spilled around her. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. A collective intake of breath from the entire plaza. Then, a flurry of motion. Phones, which had been tentatively raised, were now up and recording from a dozen different angles. The young law student from the line had a clear, steady shot. Annalise lay there for a moment, the hard, cold marble beneath her. The first thing she felt was not pain, but a white-hot flash of humiliation. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced so acutely since she was a girl, watching her father be disrespected in the same casual, brutal way. The feeling of being made small, of being seen as nothing. She let herself feel it for exactly 5 seconds. The burn of it, the sting of the hot coffee soaking through her blouse, the ache in her hip. Then she put it away. Slowly, deliberately, she began to move. She pushed herself into a sitting position. Her hands were steady. She checked her father's watch. The crystal was cracked, a thin, spiderwebbing fracture across its face. That was when the humiliation curdled into something else. Something cold and hard and clear. Not rage. Rage was a fire that consumed itself. This was ice. This was resolve. Officer Miller stood over her, his expression a mixture of surprise and a smirk. He had won. He had put her in her place. "See," he said, his voice loud for the audience. "That's what happens when you don't follow instructions. Now stay there until I say you can move." He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup at the main plaza." Uncooperative individual assaulted an officer. The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it was almost breathtaking. He was building his report in real time, for the benefit of anyone listening. Annalise looked up at him from the ground. Her eyes were clear. Her face was a mask of calm. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She began gathering her scattered papers, her movements precise, almost serene. Each sheet of paper was a piece of her dignity, and she was reclaiming it, one by one. The young female officer, his partner, rushed over. "Frank, what did you do?" she whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. "She tripped," Miller said, not looking at her. "Came at me. I put my hands up. She tripped and fell." The sound of approaching sirens began to cut through the air. The backup he'd unnecessarily called for. The machine was starting to grind. From the ground, Annalise looked past Miller, past the horrified faces in the crowd, and up at the inscription carved into the stone archway of the courthouse. Equal justice under law. The irony was so bitter it tasted like metal. She looked back at her father's watch. The hands were still moving. 8:51 a.m. Her hearing was in 39 minutes. And Officer Frank Miller was still the first name on her docket. The sirens grew louder, a wail that seemed to mourn the morning's broken peace. Sergeant Davis arrived with 2 other officers, his expression already hardened into a mask of managerial concern. He was Miller's supervisor, a man whose career depended on his subordinates not creating public spectacles. That was the first thing Annalise noticed about him. His eyes weren't on her, the woman on the ground, but on the crowd and their phones. He was assessing the optics, not the injury. "What's the situation here, Miller?" Davis asked, his voice a low rumble designed to project control. "Sergeant," Miller began, his story already polished. "This woman cut the line, became verbally aggressive. I instructed her to return to the queue. She refused, advanced on me. I put my hands up to maintain distance, and she lost her balance and fell." He gestured to the spilled coffee. "Threw her coffee at me. A masterpiece of fiction, constructed in seconds." Annalise remained seated on the cold marble, listening. She continued to gather her things, placing her cracked pen back in the briefcase, stacking her papers with an unnerving calm. Each movement was a quiet refutation of his narrative of her aggression. Sergeant Davis finally turned his attention to her. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't ask if she was hurt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stand up," he said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Annalise looked at him. In a moment, Sergeant, her voice was quiet, yet it carried. First, I need your name and badge number. And your officer's name and badge number. Davis's jaw tightened. This was not the script he was used to. He was used to tears, to shouting, to frightened compliance. Not this. Not this quiet, procedural demand. I'm Sergeant Davis. This is Officer Miller. Now, on your feet. Thank you, Sergeant Davis, she said, as if he had just done her a courtesy. She took a small, pristine notebook from an inner pocket of her briefcase, the one that had not spilled, and a spare pen. She wrote down their names. The act of documentation was a small but potent shift in power. She was no longer just a victim. She was a record keeper. The young law student, still filming, zoomed in on her writing in the notebook. He knew, with a certainty that thrilled and terrified him, that he was witnessing something far more important than a simple case of police misconduct. Finally, Annalise allowed one of the newer officers, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable, to help her to her feet. She stood, brushing the dust from her suit. A large, dark stain from the coffee marred the front of her jacket and blouse. Her hip throbbed with a deep, blooming ache. Ma'am, we need you to come with us, Sergeant Davis said. We need to get your statement. The implication was clear. She was being detained, removed from public view. I am happy to provide a statement, Annalise said. Right here. Officer Miller, without provocation, assaulted me. He shoved me with 2 hands in my chest, causing me to fall and injure my hip and elbow. He did this after I identified myself as a federal employee needing to get to my post. That's not what happened, Miller blurted out, his composure starting to crack. She's lying. Is she? A voice called out from the line. It was the young law student. Because I have the whole thing on video. Sergeant Davis's head snapped toward the student. His eyes were cold. This is an official police matter. Disperse. Now, it's a public plaza, the student said, his voice shaking but firm. He didn't lower his phone. He was the witness, and he knew the value of what he held. Annalise made eye contact with the student. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a transfer of trust. Hold it. Keep it safe. There's no need to take me anywhere, Sergeant, Annalise said, turning her attention back to Davis. As I told your officer, I work in this building. I'll be in my chambers. You know where to find me if you wish to take a formal report, though I suspect I'll be filing one of my own. She picked up her briefcase. The finality in her tone gave Davis a moment's pause. There was an authority there that didn't match the stereotype he had already assigned to her in his head. But the instinct to protect his own officer, to control the scene, overrode his curiosity. You're not going anywhere until we clear this up, Davis insisted, stepping in her path. He was doubling down, reinforcing Miller's mistake. It was the mid-level protector shielding his man. Annalise looked at him, and for the first time, a sliver of the ice in her veins entered her voice. Sergeant, you have 2 choices. You can stand aside and allow me to attend to my official duties, which are time-sensitive and mandated by federal law. Or you can continue to obstruct me, in which case this incident will escalate from a simple assault by your officer to a conspiracy to obstruct justice involving you. I ask you to choose wisely. She used the language of the law. Precise. Clinical. It was a language he was meant to understand. Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of uncertainty. The phrase conspiracy to obstruct justice was not one thrown around lightly on a plaza, but his pride, and the half-dozen phone cameras still pointed at him, made it impossible to back down. I'm not obstructing anything, he said, puffing out his chest. I'm securing a scene. There is no scene to secure, Annalise stated. There is only a federal judge who is now late for her docket. She held up her judicial ID, the one Miller had refused to see. The gold eagle of the United States federal judiciary gleamed in the morning sun. Sergeant Davis squinted at it. His face went blank. The gears were turning, but they were grinding against a wall of disbelief. It was too impossible. This woman, the one his officer had just shoved to the ground. That's a good fake, he finally said, a pathetic attempt to regain his footing. A really good one. Annalise didn't argue. She simply put the ID away. Very well, she said. She turned and began to walk, not towards the employee entrance, but back the way she came, away from the courthouse. Where are you going? Miller yelled after her, a note of panic in his voice. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The victim was supposed to stay. Annalise didn't look back. "Since you will not permit me to enter the courthouse to do my job," she called over her shoulder, her voice carrying clearly, "I am going to the U.S. Attorney's office in the adjacent building to report a crime. I'm sure they will be very interested in the video." She walked away, her back straight, her limp barely perceptible. She left them there in the wreckage of their authority, the sirens fading, the crowd murmuring, the small red recording lights of a dozen phones still shining like angry eyes. She didn't go to the U.S. Attorney's office. Not yet. That was a strategic feint, a move to disorient them, to make them think. Her real destination was her chambers. She knew a way in that they didn't. An old service entrance in the sub-basement, used by the maintenance staff. Her father had shown it to her years ago, a relic from an era of different security concerns. He'd called it the escape hatch, for days when the main doors felt too heavy. The walk around the block was a blur of pain and cold fury. Her hip was a knot of fire. Her suit was ruined. The face of her father's watch was a spiderweb of broken crystal. The physical damage was trivial. It was the violation that echoed, the casual dehumanization. The machine had tried to grind her down, just as it had countless others. But she was not just any citizen. She was a part of the machine's operating system, and she knew where the shutdown codes were. She found the nondescript metal door, keyed in a code she hadn't used in a decade, and slipped inside. The air was cool and smelled of dust and ozone. She took a freight elevator, emerging in the quiet, carpeted hallway behind her chambers. She saw no one. She unlocked her office door and stepped inside. Home. The scent of books and her faint perfume. The large window overlooking the city, now bright with late morning sun. For a moment, she leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, her eyes closed. The humiliation, which she had held at bay, washed over her. It was a physical sensation, a hot wave that left her feeling cold and exposed. The memory of the hard shove, the fall, the laughter from Miller, the sight of her papers scattered on the dirty marble. He had not seen a judge. He had not seen a professional woman. He had not even seen a person. He had seen a black woman who he believed he had the right to put his hands on. That was the real poison in the wound. She walked to her private washroom, her movements stiff. She looked in the mirror. Her hair was disheveled. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The coffee stain was a giant, ugly bloom on her white silk blouse. She looked a mess. She looked like the uncooperative individual from Miller's report. She let herself feel it. All of it. The anger, the hurt, the profound, bone-deep weariness. She gave the feeling a name, indignity. She let it fill her. She had a rule for moments like this, a technique her father had taught her. You allow yourself to feel the emotion completely, but on a timer. You give the pain its due, you honor its presence, but you do not let it take up residence. She looked at the clock on the wall. 9:07 a.m. She would give herself until 9:15. 8 minutes. For 8 minutes, she was not the Honorable Annalise Washington. She was just Annalise, a 58-year-old woman who had been assaulted and humiliated on her way to work. She gripped the edge of the marble sink, her knuckles white. A single tear traced a path through the dirt on her cheek. Then another, not from self-pity, from a deep, cold certainty about the world and her place in it. The fight was never over. It just changed form. At exactly 9:15 a.m., she took a deep breath. She washed her face, scrubbing away the dirt and the tears. She looked at her reflection again. Her eyes were clear. The storm had passed. The ice was back. She went to the closet where she kept a spare suit and blouse for emergencies. She changed quickly, her movements efficient. The fresh clothes were a new skin, a restoration of her uniform, her armor. She looked at the ruined suit on the floor. It was evidence now. She sat down at her desk. Her hands were perfectly steady as she pulled up the day's docket on her computer screen. There it was. Case number 2:23, CV 0187. Preliminary hearing. Plaintiff, United States of America. Defendant, Officer Frank Miller, City Police Department. Presiding, Judge Annalise Washington. Seeing it there, in the cold, official text of the court record, was jarring. It was no longer a personal injury. It was a professional collision. A paradox. The man who had assaulted her was now subject to her judicial authority. The system, in its blind, impartial way, had created an impossible situation. Or perhaps a perfect one. Her first instinct, the one dictated by decades of ethical training, was recusal. She could not possibly sit in judgment of the man who had just shoved her down a flight of stairs. It was a clear conflict of interest. But recusal was a surrender. It was letting him and his supervisor and the system that protected them off the hook. It was quietly removing herself from the equation and hoping someone else would see the injustice. Hope was not a strategy. She had learned a long time ago that you do not fight the machine head-on. You use its own rules, its own weight, against it. She picked up the phone and dialed her clerk, a sharp young man named Ben. "Ben," she said, her voice calm and businesslike. "We have a situation regarding the first hearing on my docket. You versus Miller. I need you to do a few things for me, and I need you to do them with absolute discretion." The counterattack had begun. It would not be loud. It would not be explosive. It would be quiet, methodical, and utterly devastating. It would be done by the book. Her book. Ben listened on the other end of the line, his pen flying across his notepad. He had worked for Judge Washington for 2 years, and he had never heard this tone in her voice before. It was the sound of a storm gathering far out at sea. "First," Annalise instructed, "I need you to locate a law student who was on the plaza this morning. He's young, maybe early 20s, likely carrying a backpack. He was filming an incident on his phone. Find him. Use the court's security network if you have to. Ask him to meet me in my chambers. Tell him it's a matter of significant importance. Do not tell him why." "Yes, Judge," Ben said, a knot of anticipation tightening in his stomach. "Second," she continued, "I want you to pull the personnel jacket for Officer Frank Miller from the City Police Liaison Office, and the jacket for his supervising sergeant, a man named Davis. Cite my authority under Federal Rule of Evidence 614. I'm not asking for it. I am directing it be delivered to my chambers within the hour." "They'll fight it, Judge. They'll claim it's confidential." "I know," Annalise said. "Tell them their objection is noted and will be entered into the record of a hearing that is about to take place. Then repeat the instruction." "Understood." "Third, and this is the most delicate." Annalise paused, choosing her words carefully. "There is a clerk in the records room, basement level. An older gentleman. His name is Marcus Henderson. He's been here for over 40 years. I believe he is our elder. He keeps records of his own. Find him. Tell him Judge Washington needs to see him. Tell him. It's about the steps." Ben didn't understand the last part, but he wrote it down verbatim. "It's about the steps." "And finally, Ben," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "get me U.S. Attorney Cole on his private line." Jonathan Cole was the professional ally. They had started as junior prosecutors together 2 decades ago. He was smart, tough, and one of the few people in the building who understood the particular burdens she carried. While Ben set the gears in motion, Annalise made one more call. To her husband, David. "It's me," she said. "Annalise, is everything all right? You sound—" "I'm fine," she said, cutting him off before he could name the iciness in her tone. "Something happened this morning. I am unhurt, but I need you to do something for me. The suit I was wearing is on the floor of my washroom. I need you to retrieve it. Place it in an evidence bag. The blouse as well. Then call Dr. Evans and schedule an appointment for me this afternoon. I need him to document the bruising on my hip and elbow. I need a full medical report." There was a silence on the other end. David was processing. He didn't ask what happened. He knew her. If she was moving like this, with this clinical precision, the details would come later. Now was the time for action. "I'm on my way," he said. His voice was steady, the anchor holding firm. "I love you. I love you too," she whispered, and hung up. The first to arrive was Marcus Henderson. He was a small, stooped man with kind eyes and skin like wrinkled parchment. He had started working in the courthouse as a young man, and he had seen generations of judges and lawyers come and go. He carried a worn leather satchel. He was the elder. "Judge," he said, his voice a soft, respectful rasp. "Ben said you asked for me. About the steps." "Marcus," Annalise said, rising to greet him. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Please sit." He sat opposite her desk, placing the satchel on his lap. He knew why he was here. He had been waiting for this call for years. "It was Officer Miller, wasn't it?" he asked. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Annalise said. "It was." Marcus Henderson nodded slowly. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a thick, black-bound ledger. It was the box of evidence. I started this 10 years ago, he said, his voice low. His first year. I saw the way he spoke to people. The way he looked for the ones he thought wouldn't fight back. The poor. The ones who didn't speak English well. The young black men. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with a neat, meticulous hand. Dates. Times. Names of victims. A brief, factual description of each incident he had witnessed or heard about from others he trusted. October 12, 2014, he read aloud. Shoved a public defender, Mrs. Rios, for walking too slow, caused her to drop her files. Laughed. May 3, 2017. Detained a teenager, Jamal Peters, for sitting on the steps. Claimed he was loitering with intent, held him for an hour. Made him miss his own hearing. September 22, 2021. Refused entry to Mr. and Mrs. Chun, who were here for their citizenship ceremony. Said their documents looked fake, they missed the ceremony. He turned a page. I have 37 entries for Officer Frank Miller, and 12 for Sergeant Davis, for signing off on false reports or dismissing complaints without investigation. He slid the ledger across the desk. I am old, Judge. My memory fades. So I write things down. I figured one day, someone might need a better memory than the one the system keeps for itself. Annalise looked at the open book. It was a monument to quiet resistance. A testament to the patience of a man who had watched injustice day after day and had done the one thing he could. He bore witness. He documented. Marcus, she said, her voice thick with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel. This is the foundation. Just then, Ben knocked and entered. Judge, U.S. Attorney Cole is here. Jonathan Cole strode in, his face a thundercloud. He was a tall, imposing man who usually carried himself with a prosecutor's swagger. Today he just looked angry. Anna, he said, forgoing her title. Ben told me the barest outline. Tell me everything. Annalise recounted the morning's events. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a recitation of facts. The refusal, the words, the shove, the fall, the cracked watch, the lie to his supervisor, Sergeant Davis's dismissal of her credentials. Cole listened, his anger deepening with every word. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. The system is designed to exhaust people like this until they give up, he said, echoing the machine metaphor she so often thought of. They never imagined it would be you. He looked at the ledger on her desk. What's this? This, Annalise said, is a decade's worth of Officer Miller's work, courtesy of Mr. Henderson. Cole picked it up, his eyes scanning the pages. A low whistle escaped his lips. This is a pattern and practice case in a single book, he murmured. This is gold, Anna. Pure gold. Another knock. It was Ben again, looking flustered but triumphant. Judge, I found him. The law student. His name is Leo Martinez. He's in the hall. And this was just delivered by a very unhappy police liaison. He handed her a thick manila envelope. Miller's and Davis's personnel files. And Judge, Ben added, his voice dropping to a whisper. Something else came. An anonymous delivery. From inside the department, I think. He handed her a second, slimmer envelope. It had no return address. Annalise looked at the clock. 9:28 a.m. The hearing was scheduled to begin in 2 minutes. The pieces were all in place. John, she said to Cole, you're prosecuting this hearing. I am going to open the proceedings. I am going to make a statement for the record about what occurred this morning. I will enter Mr. Henderson's ledger and these files as court exhibits. I will then recuse myself. You will take over and move for a summary remand of Officer Miller, and you will open a federal investigation into Sergeant Davis and the department for conspiracy and obstruction. Am I clear? Crystal, Cole said, a grim smile touching his lips. You're not just recusing. You're testifying. From the bench. The bench is my witness stand, Annalise said. She stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. She was no longer a victim. She was a judge, and court was about to be in session. Ben, show Mr. Martinez in, and tell the marshal we are ready to proceed. The hour before the hearing had been a whirlwind of controlled chaos, a race against the clock that ticked with the weight of her father's broken watch. Leo Martinez, the law student, was ushered into her chambers. He was young, nervous, but his eyes held a steady fire. He was the witness, and he seemed to understand the gravity of his role. Mr. Martinez, Annalise said, her voice calm and reassuring. I am Judge Washington. I believe you were on the plaza this morning. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He clutched his phone as if it were a holy relic. I saw what he did. I have it all. I know, she said. I'm not going to ask you for the video. Not yet. Forcing you to turn it over would make me part of a different kind of machine. Instead, I'm going to ask you to hold on to it. To trust the process. U.S. Attorney Cole's office will be in contact with you to take a formal, voluntary statement and receive a copy of the footage. Will you do that? Leo looked from her to the tall, imposing figure of Jonathan Cole. He nodded, a look of profound relief on his face. He had been terrified that the police would confiscate his phone and delete the evidence. Yes, Your Honor. Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Martinez, Annalise said. You have performed a great public service today. Now, I would ask you to please wait in the witness room down the hall. You may be called upon shortly. As Leo left, Jonathan Cole was already on his phone, dispatching an agent from his office to meet with the student, ensuring a proper chain of custody for the video. The machine of justice was beginning to turn in a new direction. Annalise sat at her desk and opened the 2 envelopes Ben had brought. The first contained the official personnel files for Miller and Davis. She scanned them quickly. Miller's was thick with civilian complaints, just as she'd suspected. A dozen in the last 5 years alone. Each one followed a pattern. An accusation of excessive force or verbal abuse, followed by a report from Miller claiming the civilian was uncooperative or aggressive, and a closing memo from Sergeant Davis finding the officer's actions within department guidelines. It was a textbook example of institutional protection. Davis's file was thinner, but more telling. It showed a steady rise through the ranks, with commendations for maintaining unit discipline. He was a good manager from the department's perspective. He made problems go away. Then she opened the second, anonymous envelope. The insider's contribution. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. They were printouts of internal emails. The first was from Sergeant Davis to another supervisor, sent 2 years prior. It read, Miller is a hothead, but he's my hothead. He keeps the street trash in line. Just make sure his reports are solid, and I'll handle the rest. The second was an email from a city attorney to Davis regarding a lawsuit that had been settled quietly. Frank cost us another $50,000. This is the 3rd time. Keep him off the front steps of the courthouse, for God's sake. The optics are terrible. The 3rd email was the most damning. It was from Miller to another officer, sent just 6 months ago. Got another complaint from some mouthy public defender. Davis already buried it. This job would be great if it weren't for the public. Annalise laid the 3 emails on her desk next to Marcus Henderson's ledger. The official file told one story, a tough but effective officer, properly managed. The ledger and the emails told the real story, a violent officer, enabled by a cynical supervisor, within a system that prioritized sweeping problems under the rug over public accountability. John, she said, her voice low. Look at this. Cole read the emails. His face, already grim, hardened into granite. That's it, he said. That's the conspiracy. It's not just about what happened to you this morning. It's about a pattern of conduct and a deliberate cover-up. We have him. We have them both. Annalise looked at the clock. 9:35 a.m. They were already late. The delay would be noted in the record. Let it be. The reason for the delay was about to become excruciatingly clear. Ben, she called out. Is the courtroom ready? Yes, Judge. The parties are waiting. Officer Miller and his counsel are at the defendant's table. They look anxious. Good, Annalise said. She stood and straightened her robes. The familiar weight on her shoulders felt different today. Heavier, but also more powerful. She picked up the anonymous emails and Mr. Henderson's ledger. She would carry them into the courtroom herself. John, she said, looking at her old friend. Are you ready? He nodded. For this? Anna, I was born ready. She walked to the door that led directly from her chambers to the bench. She paused with her hand on the knob. She could feel her heart beating, a strong, steady rhythm against her ribs. She thought of her father. He had always told her that the law was a tool. It could be used to build or to break, to protect or to punish. Today, it would be used to dismantle. She took one deep, cleansing breath. She counted to 5. Then she opened the door and walked into the courtroom. The moment she stepped through the door, a hush fell over the room. The court clerk, seeing her, stood and announced in a loud, clear voice, "All rise." The United States District Court for the Southern District is now in session. The Honorable Judge Annalise Washington presiding. The sound of shuffling feet and scraping chairs filled the space as everyone stood. Annalise walked with a deliberate, unhurried pace to the bench, her black robes flowing behind her. She did not look at the defense table. She did not look at the prosecutor's table. She looked straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the Great Seal of the United States on the wall behind the bench. She took her seat, the large leather chair sighing under her weight. "Please be seated," she said, her voice calm and resonant, amplified by the courtroom microphones. She arranged the files on the bench before her, the official case file, Mr. Henderson's ledger, and the printouts of the emails. Then, and only then, did she allow her eyes to drift to the defendant's table. Officer Frank Miller was sitting there, next to a nervous-looking lawyer from the police union. He had been looking down, shuffling papers. But as she looked at him, he glanced up. Their eyes met. The transformation on Officer Miller's face was a slow-motion cataclysm. First, there was a flicker of confusion. "Do I know you?" Twitch of the brow. He saw a black woman in a judge's robes. The context was so alien to his memory of the morning that his brain couldn't make the connection. Then he saw her eyes, the same calm, clear, unwavering eyes that had looked up at him from the marble steps. The blood drained from his face. His mouth fell slightly open. The color of his skin went from its usual ruddy flush to a pasty, sickly gray. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. It was her, the woman he had shoved, the lady he had called stupid, the uncooperative individual from his false report. She was the judge. He looked at his lawyer, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at the prosecutor, Jonathan Cole, who was staring at him with undisguised contempt. He looked back at the bench, at the woman who held his entire life in her hands. The smirk he had worn on the plaza was gone, replaced by a rictus of horror. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It stretched for 5 seconds. 10. Everyone could feel it. The sudden, radical shift in the gravitational center of the room. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. Annalise let the silence hang in the air, letting him, and everyone else, fully absorb the impossible reality of the situation. Then, she leaned into the microphone. "Good morning, counsel," she began, her voice as even and measured as if it were any other day. "We are here for the preliminary hearing in case number 2:23, CV 0187, United States versus Miller. Mr. Cole, for the government. U.S. Attorney Jonathan Cole, for the United States, Your Honor," Cole said, standing. "And for the defendant?" Annalise asked, her gaze still locked on Miller. Miller's lawyer, a man named Peterson, stumbled to his feet. Bill Peterson, for Officer Miller, Your Honor." He shot a terrified, questioning glance at his client, who seemed to have been rendered mute. "Very well," Annalise said. She folded her hands on the bench. "Before we proceed with the business of this hearing, I find it necessary to address a matter that is not on the docket, but which has a direct and profound bearing upon it. A matter of which this court has direct, personal knowledge." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Peterson was now looking utterly bewildered. Miller looked like he was about to be physically ill. "Approximately 1 hour ago," Annalise continued, her voice a clinical instrument of truth, "at 8:45 a.m., on the main plaza steps of this very courthouse, I was the victim of an unprovoked assault. The perpetrator of that assault was the defendant in this case, Officer Frank Miller." A collective gasp went through the small gallery. Peterson's jaw dropped. "While I was attempting to enter the courthouse to perform my duties," Annalise went on, her narrative clear and damning, "I was accosted by Officer Miller. Despite identifying myself as a judge and stating my need to preside over this very hearing, Officer Miller verbally abused me, refused to see my credentials, and then physically shoved me, with 2 hands, causing me to fall down a flight of stairs, sustaining injuries to my person and damage to my property." She held up her left wrist, showing the cracked face of her father's watch to the courtroom. The shattered crystal glinted under the lights. It was a more powerful statement than any testimony. Officer Miller then proceeded to file a false report via his radio, claiming I had assaulted him. His supervising officer, Sergeant Davis, arrived on the scene and, despite being informed of my identity and seeing my credentials, chose to credit Officer Miller's false narrative and attempted to obstruct my entry into this courthouse. She let that sink in. The air was thick with shock. "Your Honor, I object," Peterson stammered, finally finding his voice. This is completely out of order. My client denies these incredible allegations." Annalise looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Your objection is noted for the record, Mr. Peterson, and it is overruled. I am not making an allegation. I am making a statement of fact, as an officer of this court and a direct witness to the events described. It is not testimony. It is a judicial finding." She then picked up the black ledger. "I am now entering into the court record, as Court's Exhibit A ledger maintained by a 40-year employee of this courthouse, detailing 37 separate incidents of misconduct by Officer Miller over the past decade." She picked up the anonymous emails. "As Court's Exhibit B, I am entering 3 internal police department emails which suggest a pattern of covering up Officer Miller's behavior by his superiors, including Sergeant Davis." She looked directly at Miller. "Officer Miller, do you deny that you shoved a woman on the courthouse steps this morning?" It was a direct question, a question he could not evade. His lawyer frantically whispered for him not to answer, but Miller was frozen, caught in the high beams of her judicial authority. He just shook his head, a tiny, pathetic movement. "I see," Annalise said. "Let the record show the defendant does not deny the physical act." Finally, she turned to the matter at hand. "Given these events, it is, of course, impossible for me to preside over this hearing. The conflict of interest is absolute. Therefore, effective immediately, I am recusing myself from this case." A wave of relief washed over Peterson's face, but it was premature. "However," Annalise added, her voice turning to steel, "my recusal does not erase the facts I have just entered into the record. This matter will be reassigned to another judge immediately." "Mr. Cole," she said, turning to the prosecutor, "the government is now in possession of evidence suggesting not only the crime for which the defendant was originally charged, but also a new, separate assault, the filing of a false police report, perjury, and a conspiracy at the command level of the city police force to obstruct justice. What is the government's position?" The turning point was complete. The power had shifted. The reckoning had begun. Jonathan Cole stood, his face a mask of grim determination. He had been handed a case on a silver platter, but it was a platter forged in the fire of his friend's humiliation. There was no triumph in his posture, only a profound sense of duty. "Your Honor," he began, his voice filling the stunned silence of the courtroom. "In light of the extraordinary facts you have placed on the record and the evidence submitted as Exhibits A and B, the government's position has fundamentally changed." He turned to face the defense table, his gaze boring into Officer Miller. "The United States government hereby withdraws the original complaint in this matter, without prejudice." A flicker of hope sparked in Miller's eyes. His lawyer, Peterson, looked confused. "A withdrawal? That was a win." "We withdraw the original complaint," Cole continued, his voice dropping an octave, "because it has been superseded by a far more serious set of circumstances. Based on the direct evidence of an assault on a federal judge, the filing of a false report, and a documented history of violence and deceit, the government is filing a new criminal complaint. Effective immediately." He slapped a new file folder down on the prosecutor's table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "The new complaint charges Officer Frank Miller with assault on a federal officer, a felony under 18 U.S. Code Section 111. It further charges him with perjury and obstruction of justice. And it names Sergeant Daniel Davis as a co-conspirator in the obstruction charge." Peterson was on his feet, sputtering. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. We have had no notice, no discovery. This is a flagrant violation of my client's due process rights." "Mr. Peterson," Annalise said calmly from the bench, though she had already recused, her authority still filled the room. "This is not a trial. This is a preliminary hearing. And Mr. Cole is merely announcing the government's intent. All your client's due process rights will be afforded to him as this new case proceeds. However, the matter of his immediate status is now before the court." As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened. Judge Julian Croft, the chief judge of the district, entered. He was a stern, elderly man with a reputation for being tough but scrupulously fair. He had clearly been briefed. He walked directly to the bench, and Annalise rose. They exchanged a brief, quiet word. It was a seamless transfer of power. Annalise stepped down from the dais, her robes rustling, and took a seat in the now empty jury box. She was no longer the judge. She was the victim, the primary witness. Judge Croft took the seat she had just vacated. He surveyed the courtroom, his eyes lingering for a moment on the shattered face of Officer Miller. "I am now presiding over this matter," Judge Croft announced, his voice like gravel. "I have been apprised of the situation by Judge Washington. I have reviewed the exhibits she has placed into the record." "Mr. Cole, you were saying?" Cole, who had remained standing, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Given the violent nature of the assault this morning, the defendant's proven history of aggression, and the overwhelming evidence of his willingness to lie and obstruct justice to cover his tracks, the government believes he poses an ongoing danger to the community and is a significant flight risk. Therefore, we are moving for immediate remand. No bail. No bail." Peterson shouted, his professional decorum completely gone. "That's insane. He's a decorated police officer. He has ties to the community. He is a man who assaulted a federal judge in broad daylight on the steps of her own courthouse." Cole shot back. "His ties to the community are a trail of brutalized citizens and buried complaints. He has shown he believes he is above the law. The idea that he would honor a court order to appear is laughable." Judge Croft held up a hand. "Enough." He looked down at Miller. "Officer Miller, stand up." Miller, moving like a man in a dream, slowly got to his feet. He was trembling. "Son," Judge Croft said, his voice surprisingly gentle, which only made it more terrifying. "You seem to have found yourself in a world of trouble. I have here a ledger, detailing years of alleged misconduct. I have internal police emails suggesting a cover-up. And I have the word of a fellow federal judge, a woman I have known for 20 years and whose integrity is beyond reproach. What I don't have is any reason to believe a single word that might come out of your mouth. The motion for remand is granted." The gavel came down. Crack. The sound was final. Absolute. "Your Honor, you can't." Peterson pleaded. "I can, and I have," Judge Croft said coldly. "2 federal marshals will escort Officer Miller to the holding facility. Furthermore, I am issuing a bench warrant for the immediate arrest of Sergeant Daniel Davis on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice. The U.S. Attorney's Office will coordinate with the FBI to bring him into custody." 2 large men in dark suits who had been standing impassively at the back of the courtroom began to walk forward. They were the federal marshals. Their movements were fluid and economical. Miller watched them approach, his face a mask of disbelief. This wasn't happening. Cops didn't arrest other cops. Certainly not for something like this. The system was supposed to protect him. The marshals reached the defense table. One of them produced a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click as they were opened was the loudest sound Miller had ever heard. "Frank Miller," one of the marshals said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest. Put your hands behind your back." Miller didn't move. He was frozen. The marshal reached out and firmly took his arm. That physical contact broke the spell. Miller flinched, pulling his arm back. "Get your hands off me," he snarled, a last, pathetic echo of the bully on the steps. The second marshal moved in instantly. In one smooth, practiced motion, they had Miller's arms pinned behind his back. The handcuffs were snapped on. The irony was a physical thing in the room. The man who had built his career on the casual, dominant use of force and restraints was now being restrained himself, with a professional efficiency he could never have matched. He was led out of the courtroom, his head bowed, his uniform now a costume of shame. He didn't look at Annalise as they passed the jury box, but she watched him. She felt nothing. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just a profound, sorrowful sense of necessity. The machine had been righted. A broken cog had been removed. The reckoning wasn't over. It had just begun. Judge Croft looked at Jonathan Cole. "Mr. Cole," he said, "your investigation into the city police department has the full backing of this court. Leave no stone unturned." Cole nodded. "We won't, Your Honor." The public fallout was swift and brutal. The video Leo Martinez had taken was released by the U.S. Attorney's Office. It went viral within hours. The clear, undeniable footage of Officer Miller's aggressive posture, his sneering words, and the violent, unprovoked shove sent a shockwave through the city. Juxtaposed with the image of Judge Annalise Washington's calm dignity, it was a narrative no amount of spin could overcome. Sergeant Davis was arrested at his desk later that afternoon. The image of the FBI leading him in handcuffs from the precinct headquarters he once ran became the lead story on the evening news. His defense, that he was just handling a situation, crumbled in the face of the emails Annalise had entered into the record. The insider, a young female officer named Elena Reyes who was tired of the toxic culture, came forward voluntarily. Her testimony, corroborating the emails and detailing the long-standing pattern of Miller's abuse and Davis's complicity, broke the case wide open. The police union, which had initially issued a statement defending the officers, fell silent, then quietly withdrew its legal support for both men. The machine of institutional protection had hit a wall it could not breach. A federal judge, armed with unimpeachable evidence and the full weight of the U.S. government. Facing a mountain of evidence and the prospect of a long federal prison sentence, Miller and Davis took plea deals. Miller pleaded guilty to assault on a federal officer and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Davis, for his role in the conspiracy to obstruct justice, received 18 months. During his sentencing, he tearfully apologized, not to Annalise, but to the court for the embarrassment he had caused. Judge Croft noted for the record that he seemed more sorry he got caught than for the actions themselves. But the story did not end with their individual punishments. Jonathan Cole, true to Judge Croft's directive, launched a full-scale pattern and practice investigation into the city police department. Marcus Henderson's ledger, once a private document of sorrow, became the foundational roadmap for the investigation. Each of the 37 entries was investigated. Victims who had long since given up hope were contacted and gave formal statements. Mrs. Rios, the public defender Miller had shoved years ago, wept when she received the call. Jamal Peters, the teenager detained for loitering, was now a young man in his 20s. He became a lead plaintiff in a class-action civil rights lawsuit. The investigation uncovered a deep-seated culture of misconduct, enabled by a command structure that valued loyalty over integrity. The police chief resigned. The mayor, under immense public pressure, agreed to a federal consent decree mandating sweeping systemic reforms. A new, independent civilian oversight board, revamped use of force policies, and a mandatory duty to intervene protocol for all officers. Annalise watched it all unfold from a distance. She had taken her remaining 21 days of leave, the first real vacation she'd had in years. She did not grant any interviews. She made no public statements. She had said everything she needed to say from the bench. Her role in the reckoning was over. The system, once turned in the right direction, was now moving under its own power. Her days took on a new, quieter rhythm. She spent mornings in her garden with David, her hands in the soil. He had carefully replaced the cracked crystal on her father's watch. It was a small act of restoration, but it meant everything. The scar on the watch was gone, but the memory remained. She met with Leo Martinez for coffee one afternoon. The law student was no longer nervous. He was filled with a new sense of purpose. He had been offered a prestigious internship with the U.S. Attorney's Office. "I almost didn't film it," he confessed to her. "I was scared. I thought, what's the point? Nothing ever changes." "But you did it anyway," Annalise said. "That's the point. You act not because you are certain of the outcome, but because the action itself is necessary." He was the witness who had become an actor. He was the future. On her last day of leave, Annalise woke at her usual time, 5:15 a.m. She sat at her father's desk, wound his watch, and made her coffee. The rituals were the same, but she felt different. Lighter. The weight of the world was still there, but so was a renewed sense of hope. She put on a simple dress, not a suit. She drove downtown, the morning traffic a familiar river. She parked not in her reserved spot, but in the public lot 3 blocks away. She walked. When she got to the coffee cart, the vendor, a man she'd never spoken to before, nodded at her. "On the house today, Judge," he said, handing her a cup of black coffee. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Thank you." She approached the courthouse plaza. The bottleneck was gone. All 3 security lines were open and moving efficiently. There were new officers on duty, younger ones, who greeted people with "good morning" and "please." Annalise walked to the base of the grand marble steps, the same spot where she had fallen. She paused, coffee in one hand, her briefcase in the other. The morning sun was warm on her face, just as it had been that day. The light quality was the same. The architecture was the same, but the atmosphere was transformed. She looked up at the inscription, "Equal justice under law." For the first time in a long time, it felt less like a distant aspiration and more like a work in progress. She took a sip of her coffee. It was hot, strong, and not bitter at all. Then, with a steady, even gait, she walked up the steps and into the courthouse, ready to get back to work. The quiet return to normalcy was its own kind of victory. The resolution was not in the punishment of one man, but in the restoration of peace and the reaffirmation of dignity for all the others who would walk these steps tomorrow. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.